My guest today is Mark Beale. He is the Vicar of St Elizabeth's Anglican Church in Clendon. Mark, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
As well as the work that you do at a parish level, if you like, or something you do as a part of that parish, as a community, you work with the local prison community as well. What led you into that work?
5 years ago, the women's prison was built, and it's actually built within our parish boundaries, so it's just down the road from us. So it was important to become engaged in that, and so I made myself known to the prison. They invited us in to help run programs and Sunday services, and that led to me running alpha courses, Bible studies and so on within the prison. And that sort of grew in its own speed, because the natural consequence of that is when women were being released from the prison, they sought our help, particularly if they were moving into the community. So a connection started to be made between working within the prison and working outside of the prison. And so before we knew what was happening, a lot of these women were becoming members of our congregation and start to engage in the life of the church community outside the prison. I think the most important thing theologically and biblically to understand is that as Christians we believe in a God who enables change, and that lives can be transformed, they can be made new, and all the way through Old Testament and New Testament there's this underlying ethos in Scripture that a person can change and come into the likeness of God. I mean, you've got it with Moses. I mean, we don't look at him as a murderer, we look at him as a lawgiver. You take King David, we don't look at him as a person who was adulterous and a murderer, but we look at him as a man after God's own heart. We look at Paul, we don't see him as a person who murdered Christians, we see him as the greatest evangelist to the Gentiles. And so people can change. The tragedy in New Zealand society is that's often not accepted. And so I find the hardest thing is when I'm working with a person, for example, one woman who was 14 when she committed a very violent murder. She's now in her mid to late 20s, and the media still labour her as a killer. But is she? I mean, she's gone through a whole lot of transformation in prison, she's gone through alpha courses, Bible studies, become a Christian, and is a different person. But society doesn't allow her to be a different person. And theologically and biblically, as Christians, we must allow people to become a new person. Otherwise, we're denying the very heart of the biblical understanding of transformation and renewal.
How essential or important do you feel faith is in the transformation or the restoration process, or even rehabilitation when coming out of the prison environment?
It's the critical factor. I'd go as far as say that a person won't come through true rehabilitation without the faith factor, because there's got to be a transformation of the heart, and only Christ can do that. And all of the women and men that I've dealt with who've come out of prison, I know if they keep coming to church each week, keep being involved in the church programs, I can relax. As soon as they stop doing that, I know I've got trouble, because the faith part is the most essential one. As I said before, the other programs become effective when the faith one has happened. Yeah. And we know that as Christians within our own lives, that it's our connection with God that actually keeps us on track to become the person that God created us to be.
The concept, though, of there being consequences to the personal choices that we make, some would also say that this is a strong biblical principle.
And that's true, and you'll find most people who have gone to prison will say that. I mean, one of the first women that I dealt with, she's been out for 5 years now, she'll say, I needed to go to prison. She was involved in the cooking, selling and taking of pee as a drug, which led to all sorts of other crimes. And she said, my life was out of control. I needed to go there. The problem is not that. The problem is whether rehabilitation and transformation occurs from that point on. And whether when a person has been rehabilitated, been transformed, become a new person, whether we allow them to become a constructive, useful person in society again. or whether we hold them back in that prison mentality. And I think we generally hold them back in that prison mentality, and that's why we have so much reoffending, because we haven't actually set people free from that. Society needs to realise that there but for the grace of God go I. And one of the things I learnt very quickly when I was working, particularly in the women's prison, sitting with a group of women doing a Bible study, there was a very thin line between me and them. That I can't sit there and say, well, I'm a good person, I've never done anything wrong, I wouldn't have the tendency to do anything wrong because I haven't lived with the circumstances and lifestyle that they've had to deal with. Every one of us has a capacity to good and evil. And all sorts of things happen in life where we may make wrong choices. And yes, we should have to live with the consequence of that choice. King David did. He could never shake off the bad decisions he made with Bathsheba. That lived with him. It lived with his sons. And it will. But that's not how we label him. We label him as a man after God's own heart, and we need to change the labels that we give people in terms of, otherwise we entrap them in that label. And I find with people who've had a life of horrendous crime, when they've experienced the power of God's forgiveness, they experience the acceptance of the community, particularly the church, their sense of gratitude's enormous. And they'll do anything they can to repay back to the community what has happened.
Mark, thank you so much for the inspiring work that you do, and thanks for being part of the program.
Welcome.